Okay,
That's how we know who they are. Sometimes we well, AA.
Rick, y'all sitting over there today?
yeah. What's that?
You sitting over there today? I'm just thinking afterwards when I'm closing everything out, I'll try to step aside to the right. That way you can come this way. Yeah, when I was in
Hair back is you got a cut.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go ahead and get started. We're looking at the life of Joseph this morning. Joseph. And so we're going to be looking and trying to skim through and hit some highlights of the last 13 or so chapters in the book of Genesis. To be honest, I do not expect we're going to get through all 13 unless, well, I just don't think we'll get through all 13, but we'll try to hit as many highlights in Joseph's lives as we possibly can, because he is such an important figure, such an interesting figure, and on some level I wonder if he may be a misunderstood figure. Because let's be honest, there's parts of our life that we see ourselves in Joseph. Like if you've ever had a point in your life, a time in your life where life just kind of seemed completely and totally out of your control. Like you get to a point in your life, you're looking around like, how in the world did I get here? Why is this happening to me? Joseph knew how that felt. But Joseph's story, Joseph's life in the last 13 chapters of the book also shows us how God was with him every step of the way. And how God used that tragedy, not to spoil the surprise, and turned it into a story of redemption and salvation. And so let's dig into that story really quickly. Let's start by just asking, as you were looking and reading about Joseph in our daily Bible reading this week, did anything about Joseph's life jump out to you? From beginning to end, let's start with big picture, just highlight stuff that you know about Joseph's life.
Well, the thing that sticks out in my mind is how God works through his providence. He didn't do things miraculous, and he used life circumstances to achieve what his plan was.
Yeah, and I think that's an awesome thing to notice in his life. That even though his life takes about 13 chapters, what's really interesting is you break down the entire book of Genesis, the entire story of Genesis, the word God, G-O-D, as you see in your English Bibles, or Lord, the capital L-O-R-D, that usually is the English translation of Yahweh, is used only about one time per chapter. God is one time per chapter or so. Lord is about one time per chapter, on average. What's interesting is they're both in the prior 36 chapters, used about 4 or 5 times each per chapter. And so when you get to the life of Joseph, the use of the word God and the use of the word Lord falls off the face of the map. It's kind of like Esther. Like when you look at Esther's story, the word God, to the best of my knowledge, to the best of my memory, never appears in Esther's story. But you see God's fingerprints all over the story. You see God's providence throughout the story, and you see it with Joseph, excuse me. That God is all over that story. What else do you notice in the life of Joseph?
I think it's interesting that Joseph has that dream about, his brothers bowing down to him, and that plays out in the end, but there's a lot of trials and tribulations in between. But I just always think about how Joseph dealt with that during his trials and tribulations, because did he recognize God was seeing him through those trials?
Yeah. Joseph's faith journey from Genesis 37 when he has those dreams, and we'll look at those here pretty shortly, to the end when he stands before his brothers and gives this final, call, this final act of forgiveness in Genesis 50 is really, really interesting. Ray, I saw
I
that.
I was going to mention faith, his faith constantly. No
Yeah.
matter what happened, he was.
And I think Jacob's faith, or Joseph's faith, excuse me, is really interesting here because, like so many of the patriarchs before him, his faith journey is not this. I think if you really look at his story, his life story, his faith journey is something like this. It's a little more bumpy than maybe we have used in the past, especially in our kids' classes, because in our kids' classes we have a tendency to Disneyfy our patriarchs, to take some of these stories that are PG-13 or rated R, and we make them G-rated. We kind of smooth them out, make them a little more kid-appropriate. And Joseph's story is very bumpy at times, but you also see the growth of faith there. Yes?
I noticed it too with Joseph, through really no fault of his own, perceptions of him or the way that he, like his dad chose him, he didn't have any control over that, but his dad favored him. God gives him these dreams. He is talking with them, with his brothers, but his brothers hated him, all because of the perception, and it wasn't anything that he particularly did to bring on that perception. So I felt kind of bad for him. It's like no matter what he does, it's just like he's trying to look out for his brothers, or he's just trying to fit in, and they're just like, poor guy.
Yeah, there's especially Genesis 37, and I want to share some things in Genesis 37 that'll tie into what you're saying, and I think what Rob said a moment ago, that may challenge our perception a little bit of Joseph as we wrestle with especially the first part of his life. Because I want to suggest just here in a second that maybe, this is my opinion, my judgment, I want to be very open about that, that maybe when we meet Joseph here in Genesis 37, he's like most teenage boys, a little bratty. And I think we see it kind of play out a little bit here in the story. But like you said, some of the things, he's not responsible for his mom, his dad, making him the favorite son. That's not his fault. He can't help that. There are certain things in his life that he just can't help, and yet he has to deal with sometimes the consequences of that. Any other thoughts before we dive into the story together? Okay, Genesis chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land, verse 1, where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And these are the family records of Jacob. Pause there really quickly. You're going to see that phrase throughout the book of Genesis. You've probably seen it several times. That is a really big idea in terms of the transition of the narrative there in Genesis. And at 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. And remember, this family is a family of farmers. They are shepherds, and so tending sheep, taking care of animals is what they did. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wife, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. What do you make about the word bad report? Tattletale. Yeah. Those of you who had kids, have you ever had a kid tattletale? Okay, those of you when you were kids, did you ever tattletale?
No.
There's one in every crowd. And it's usually me. So Todd, thank you for speaking up. A couple things about that phrase that is translated bad report, not tattletale, bad report there in the text. That word in Numbers 13, verse 32, Numbers 14 and verse 32, and Proverbs, if I'm reading my handwriting correctly, 10 and verse 18, is used in the context of lying or slander. And so it's very interesting that it's possible that what Joseph is doing here is not just bringing, hey, Dad, your sons are lazy, but perhaps it's gone beyond that and brought even a slanderous report about them, about his brothers to his father. It's possible. Now, Israel, I think that's interesting. Verse 1, Jacob. Verse 3, Israel. That's interesting. Loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was the son born to him in his old age, and also the first son of his favorite wife. And he made a long-sleeved robe. You may have a multicolored tunic or whatever your translation says, something along that line for him. Okay. Pause here for station identification. I want us to pay attention to close in Joseph's story. As we're working through as much as we can this morning, pay attention in his narrative to the close and what is happening to his clothes, and the place that clothes play in his narrative, because it's really, really, really interesting. And so he has this multicolored, this long sleeve robe, whatever it may be, there in the text. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. And Joseph had a dream. And he talks about his dream. He shares this dream, verse 30, in chapter 37, to his brothers about binding sheaves, and all the sheaves are bowing down to him. And then he shares another dream about the sun and the moon and the stars all bowing down to him. And everybody understands what he's talking about. Just for a second, put yourself in their shoes, in Joseph's brother's shoes, in Joseph's father's shoes. How would you handle it if your sibling, your mom, your dad, somebody in your family was always going around telling this story, this dream about how everybody in the family is going to bow down to him? What's your response? You're thinking they're crazy, or you're going to hate them even more. And that's what happens here in the text. And they were jealous. But what's interesting there in verse 11 is that his father kept this matter in mind. That's very interesting language to me, because you see very similar thoughts, a very similar phrase in Luke's gospel when Mary sees Jesus growing up, and the text says how Mary treasured these thoughts in her heart. That's very interesting, similar language that you see these two important people in salvation history, Joseph and Jesus, and very similar things are said about them in their childhood. And yet, Joseph's brothers, because of their hate of Joseph, sell him into slavery. They sell him to the Midianite traders who take Joseph down to Egypt. And we could have a lot of fun with the Joseph story and writing the parallels between Joseph and Jesus. Like if we had a whiteboard up here, we could pause right here and really break some parallels down. And that would be an interesting study to do sometime. Maybe do it on your own time. And that's one of them. Both of them at a young age, Jesus as an infant, Joseph as a teenager, go down to Egypt. And so it's down in Egypt where Joseph is. And then for some reason, there's a break in the Joseph narrative there in chapter 38, where we read about Judah and Tamar and how Judah sleeps with Tamar, and there's 2 kids born from that incident, that sin, that transgression. And I think if you break it down, both Joseph and Judah leave the land. There in verse 38 and verse 1, that Judah left his brothers and settled near an Adullamite named Hira. Both have left the family. Both have left the land. Both go down, and while they're away from their family, they have kids. But now back in 39, we're back in the Joseph narrative. And Joseph is down in Egypt. He's with a guy named Potiphar, who's an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guards, who had brought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him there. And the Lord, this is key, was with Joseph. In fact, let's just pause here and break down what are the key reasons for Joseph's success in Potiphar's house. I mean, you can look there in verse 2, verse 3, verse 5, verse 6, verse 21, verse 23. What are the key reasons that Joseph is successful, away from his family, away from his friends, away from his comfort zone? Why is Joseph successful? The Lord was with him. That even though he has left the family or been forced away from his family and he's in a foreign land, the Lord was still with him. And when the master saw, verse 3, that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor, verse 4, with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. And from the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. Okay, how often have we seen the Lord blessing the patriarchs? Like every single patriarch at some point in time has a moment in their life where it said that the Lord blessed them. And this is how. And the Lord's blessing, verse 5, was on all that he owned, in his house and in the fields. And he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority, and he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Okay, we're going to have a quick test. A quick test, pop quiz. One question, pass, fail. Which I always thought was easier. What have we said, what have we noticed about physical descriptions in the book of Genesis so far? Have you noticed anything about physical descriptions in the book of Genesis? What do they tell us? Do they give us any hint? Any clue about what's about to happen? Yeah, they do. Is something good or something bad about to happen? Something bad. You see, almost every time, I want to say every time, but I'm going to leave room for that almost. Almost every time you see in the book of Genesis physical descriptions of somebody or something, it's usually a hint that something bad is about to happen. Go back to the garden. Eve saw that the fruit was desirable and pretty and all these physical descriptions. You look ahead and how Sarah, or Sarai at the time, is described as beautiful. And so what does Abram do? He lies to Abimelech. He lies to Pharaoh. All throughout the Genesis story, physical descriptions are usually signs something bad is about to happen. And it's no different here. That Joseph is well built and handsome. That's interesting. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me," but he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. He has put all things, all that he owns, under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" What jumps out to you about Joseph's response? Go. Yeah.
He was very aware of how successful he was.
Yeah.
He was, and the status that he had.
Yeah.
You take that same situation with a different personality, and you could really use that to your advantage.
Yes.
But Joseph didn't do that.
No.
So he was keenly aware of that, and God was in the forefront. Because
Yeah.
I've got all this, how can I do this great wickedness, not against my master, but against God?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. You think about, and we've seen this in our own life. Maybe with people we know, people we love, we can care about, maybe even ourselves, that we've seen them reach a certain level of success and then implode, morally speaking. There's a phenomenal book, I think it's called Leadership Deception, that kind of talks about that, if I'm remembering my books correctly. But, yeah, you see that. To anybody else, that maybe one of his 11 other brothers, if the roles were reversed, maybe they take advantage of this opportunity. But Joseph doesn't. What else jumps out about Joseph's response there in the text?
Kind of playing off where Rick was going, but I think perhaps you see it here. You could take Joseph's life, it seems to me, and map it out as someone who was on a quest to rise to the very top. He ends up driving the bus in Pharaoh's place, and you know, you can see this sort of ascending thing going on with him. And if you laid it alongside of just about any political person you see today, all of those guys are fighting their way to the top. All of our politicians of today are on this quest, and whatever gets in their way, whatever they've got to do to get it out of their way, and yet I think you see a humility that's in the middle of what he's doing. It seems like at any place along the way, he would have been content to be where he was. And I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is it seems to me in today's times that humility is a lost concept.
That's an interesting thought as you look at his life on so many levels, because as you point out with today's politicians, they're not opening their own doors. Or excuse me, they're opening their own doors. They're not opening their own doors. They're forcing those doors open, right? But with Joseph, he allows God to open those doors at God's appointed time. And you see him just in contentment with where he's out, and that humility and that contentment, I think, plays a role here. I think that's a great point here.
And I think he would have been content at any time that God stopped opening doors.
Yeah.
He'd have been fine to be right there.
He'd been fine to be a servant in Potiphar's house, being the best servant he could be. He would have been fine any place he would be. Oh, that's a great point. Yes.
I just see his sense of loyalty as well. He's a very loyal servant to Potiphar.
Yeah.
And respectful. You know, it's like he's not withheld anything from me
Yeah.
except you. You're a hands-off situation.
Yeah.
And I just appreciate
Yeah.
his sense of loyalty and duty to Potiphar and to the Lord.
Yeah. It's funny that those are two traits that I'm not sure I would have pulled out into Bible class today. And I think they're great traits to consider, which is one reason I like Bible class so much, is we all see different things in the text and we get to learn from one another. And that. For me, when I look at Joseph's response, I see a man whose defense against sin ultimately was a heart that wanted to please God more than he wanted the pleasures of sin. And I think there's a lesson for us there. Not only loyalty, not only humility, but also where his heart was set. That even though he's in a faraway land, even though this is before Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, mom and dad are not going to find out about this. And yet he's still focused on God. He still knows, even though he's far away from home, even though he's in a land that in that day, in that age, gods were geographically based oftentimes. He still understands that God sees and God cares. That's interesting. And this sin, this temptation goes on. It's not a one-time thing. It's day by day, verse 10. And so one day he goes into work and he's doing his job, and his master's wife grabs his clothes and says, "Sleep with me." And he left his garment behind and ran out. Wait a second, garment behind. Have we seen Joseph's garment mentioned before? That's very interesting. And now the garment that had signified his place in the palace is now the garment that is used to make a false accusation against him. Yes?
this might be the wrong time, but when I read this account right here,
Yeah.
there's a lesson to life right here. I'm a city employee.
Yeah.
I have to go to citizens, sometimes they're residents, for some issue, and they'll say, come on into the house.
Yeah.
When you're by yourself, you have to be aware of your surroundings. You don't go into someone's house without another coworker
Yeah.
as a witness.
Yeah.
Don't put yourself in those situations to where if something should happen, it's your word against someone else's word.
Yeah.
But, so I kind of just took that as a life lesson also.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that we could put that scenario into.
100% in terms of don't put yourself, I mean, that's a lesson, maybe not from his life, but from this story, I think we can pull out of it. Don't put yourself in compromising situations. That is such an important lesson for us to learn in this day, in this age, for all of us. And so now his garments are used to make this false accusation, and because of this false accusation, he is thrown in prison. But even in prison, the Lord, verse 21, is with him and showed kindness to him, and he granted him favor with the prison warden. And the warden, verse 23, did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And the Lord made everything he did successful. And then there in chapter 40, we see two dreams. Could someone summarize those two dreams that we read about and the interpretation of those dreams there in Genesis chapter 40? One dream to the cupbearer and one dream to the baker. If someone wants to just kind of summarize those in your words and the interpretation of those two dreams.
I don't understand what you're asking, I guess.
Yeah.
But other than very simply, one's gonna be restored, and one's gonna die.
Yeah, that's the interpretation. Yeah, you have one where there's the cupbearer. There's the dream where there's this vine and he squeezes the juice and puts it in Pharaoh's head, and that symbolizes that, hey, you're going to be restored. And the bread baker, it's baked and all the birds were eating it out of the basket, and Joseph's interpreter said, you're going to die in 3 days. And a couple days later, the Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, but the chief cupbearer forgot Joseph. And at the end of 2 years, chapter 41, Pharaoh had a dream, and he's standing beside the Nile River. And there's 7 healthy, well-fed cows coming up from the Nile, and they begin to graze among the reeds. And then 7 sickly cows, verse 3, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. And those sickly, thin cows ate up the healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Wouldn't you wake up after that dream? That is a weird dream. And then there's another dream, and he fell asleep again. And the second time, 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up in one stalk. And after them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. And the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. And when morning came, he was troubled, and he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, and no one could interpret them. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards, and he and I had dreams on the same night. Each had a dream with its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, Joseph, was down there, and he told us the dream, he told us the interpretation, and it happened just like he said. In verse 14, Pharaoh sent for Joseph and quickly brought him from the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothes, and went out to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard that you can. And in verse 16, I am not able to, but it is God, Joseph says, who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And so Pharaoh tells the dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams, and tells the king that the dreams mean the same thing, that you're about to have 7 years of plenty, 7 years where the crops, it's bumper crops 7 years in a row. But after that, 7 years of famine. And it's going to happen quickly. It's going to happen urgently. And you need to make plans. And so if you'll listen to me, here's what I would advise you to do. And he says, take some of the crops, these bumper crops, and set them in reserve during the 7 years of famine. And that way the country won't be wiped out. Take a little historical note real quick. Egypt in the ancient world was the breadbasket of the ancient world. A lot of food came from Egypt. And so when Egypt had a drought, when Egypt wasn't producing food, that had massive repercussions for the rest of the world. And we're going to see how that plays out and how that affects the rest of the world here in just a few chapters. Well, let's start by thinking about this question. How does Joseph's time in prison demonstrate God's ongoing faithfulness in his life? You would think that Joseph's time in prison, perhaps that maybe God wasn't being faithful to his promises. But it's quite the opposite. That we see that even in prison, God is faithful to Joseph. God is with Joseph. And so how do we see that play out here in Genesis 40 and 41? Yeah.
Well, I think just in general, you know, if you, and I'll jump over to the book of Job for a minute. Job's friends are all in at first, right? With God is with Joseph, and all these things are happening. And then he goes into prison and says, but God was still with him. They go, yeah, that wouldn't happen because he did stuff, bad stuff.
Yeah.
And so, but service to God, and by the way, Joseph could have spent the rest of his life in prison in this in an alternate narrative.
Yeah.
And God was still with him.
Yeah.
My point being, God being with us is outside of circumstance, and we have a very narrow view of that because of the world that we're fortunate enough to live in. But if we look at the broader world, that's not the case. And so we think, well, how can God be with this person or with these people or with it? But if they're serving him, he is.
Yeah.
Regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in.
That is so important to think about. That, yeah, God was with him, and God brought him out of the pit, out of the prison. But even if Joseph had stayed in the prison, God was still with him. That God is still with us regardless of what happens to us in our life. And that's something so easily we forget.
The other thing that's interesting, I mean, there's not a lot of talk about his time in prison. I mean,
Yeah.
we just know that, you know, basically whatever they gave him to do, he succeeded. But and this is just conjecture on my part. I mean, again, to Chris's point, a different narrative. He could have used that to his advantage. Probably could have got out some work detail, you know. But I can only assume that he was doing the work along with other folks. He wasn't shirking responsibility.
Yeah.
He was giving it his all. He was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, you could have very easily put in that position, have become sullen and depressed, and God was with him, and it's kind of you know, in the New Testament, you know, found whatever state I'm in there with to be content, and I think that's Joseph. You know, he's like, I'm just going to keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
I also think that it demonstrates, again, God's providence over everything.
Yeah.
In how we look at the entire story, Joseph had to be sold into slavery. Joseph had to be in Egypt in order for God to spare the people to come down and get sustenance from Egypt. He had to be put in these places. It was God's providential plan.
Yeah.
And we see that overarching in everything in the scriptures. Like Pharaoh with Moses. God knew Pharaoh's heart. He knew the kind of person Pharaoh was going to be, and he used Pharaoh to accomplish his stuff. And I just see the same kind of overarching theme when it comes to Joseph. You know, God was going to have his way.
Yeah.
Things were going to get accomplished, and you know, he put people in place. And maybe when we personalize that, we have a reason that we're here in this time, in this space, all the time. So we have to be aware that we're part of that same arc,
Yeah.
that same plan.
Yeah. You see God's providence in Joseph's journey from the pit that his brothers put him in, to prison here that we just read about, to the palace of Pharaoh. Todd and then Chris, and I think Robbie may have hand.
This story of Joseph in prison reminds me a lot of when Gabriel has a conversation with Daniel. And the conversation, and Daniel goes, look, you don't have the big picture. Things are happening, we're working on it, and it will happen in its time. And then he's kind enough to tell him what's going to happen. But we need, I don't know, I think that it is kind of prudent of us to not just focus on the story of Joseph and God and Joseph, because God is also the God of Egypt. God is the God of every person on the planet. Pharaoh knows God. Pharaoh will represent the fact that he knows God with how he renames Joseph.
Yep.
He knows God. He has a relationship with him. God is also the God of Egypt, and he has a plan for Egypt also.
Yeah.
So, and to Gina's point, these all will come together in God's way. So
Yeah.
we can't sit here and say, you know what, that's a raw deal. Joseph's in jail.
Yeah.
No, it's not. God's going to do it His way.
Yeah. And the parallel between Joseph's story and Daniel's story in terms of seeing God's providence and how God is in control, even though Joseph may not have seen it or understood it in his life, or Daniel may not have seen it and understood it in his life, the end result of both stories is the same. That God is in control and is going to use history in this world to accomplish His saving purposes. And that's what you see play out in both stories, Chris and Rob.
Yeah, well, this is not how we write the story, right? How we write the story is he does this, he goes to prison, he gets exalted, he saves his brothers, and then Jesus comes through his line. But that's not what happens.
Yeah.
That interlude is super important
Yeah.
because the line of Jesus does not come through Joseph.
Yeah.
And so so we need to pay attention to that, because as we go further in the narrative through the Bible, that plays a key role in sort of how God operates and what God does.
Yeah. And it's interesting you bring up the point right here and right now that Jesus does not come through Joseph's line. And just pause real quickly. One of the interesting storylines we see throughout the patriarchal narrative is the guy you would expect Jesus to come through, the oldest son, the favorite son, is not the guy through whom Jesus comes. You see that with over and over in the patriarchal narrative, Rob.
I'm going to piggyback on Gina and Todd. We focus on Joseph's story, but there's this providence of God in His own time that jumps out at me with regard to the magicians. And really, they couldn't have made some interpretation of that dream?
Yeah.
But they did. They acknowledged, we don't know. So it's kind of an interesting twist.
Especially since you consider that Egypt would have had their fair share of wise men. Egypt at this point in time is probably the most powerful nation on the face of the planet. And yet their wisest men, their cabinet, if I can use that term, they're completely clueless on what's going on. And it's this guy in prison, this Hebrew, this guy named Joseph, who is not an Egyptian, who steps up and says, here's what's about to happen. for me, as you look at Joseph's life, you see, and this kind of maybe ties some of these thoughts together, how the dreams of Joseph got Joseph into trouble. But it's now Joseph's ability to interpret dreams that's going to get him out of the pit. God is faithful through all of this. God has his hands on all of this. Even though God is not necessarily directly speaking to Joseph. And there in chapter 41, Joseph is exalted. He's number 2, basically, in the king of in the nation of Egypt, which is really, really super interesting for me as a guy who likes history. That the guy, a member of the family of God, is essentially vice president. And what happens there in verse 42? Pharaoh removed his signet ring and from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. The man who found himself in prison because of the favorite garments, who put on the prison garments, is now wearing palace garments and ruling over the most powerful nation in Egypt. And Pharaoh gives him this name, which somebody brought out a moment ago. I think it might have been Rob. Zaphanethapaneah. So those of you, Allison, we're not going to use that name. Just going to say that. Basically means God speaks and lives. And now Joseph is 30 years old when he is now serving and working with Pharaoh, and he gets married and he has 2 kids. One named Manasseh, which basically translates out that God has made me forget my whole family in my hardship. And the second was Ephraim, that God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. His names of his sons are interesting as you see his story progress. And now the famine hits in chapter 42. And his brothers go down to get some food, and they're there. And Joseph recognizes his brothers. And their brothers bow down to him because he's wearing royal garments. They recognize him as somebody in power, and they're bowing down, thus fulfilling the prophecy or the dream that we read about in Genesis chapter 37. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. From where do you come from? And they're like, from the land of Canaan to buy food. He gives them a little bit of a hard time. And they don't recognize him. And a lot of times that kind of messes with us. How do you not recognize your brother? It's been 13 years. It's been a while. If you haven't seen... it's more than 13. He is 30 years old when he enters... So he's 37, so it's more like 20 years. 20 years have gone by. Good point, good catch. 20 years have gone by. If you haven't seen somebody in 20 years, especially from 17 to 37, you're going to see some changes. If you look back at some of my Facebook pictures of Austin when he was 18, and look at Austin now that I'm almost 38, there's some noticeable changes in Austin and how I look. And certainly you may recognize it. But a couple things to keep in mind as we're thinking about this, just from a cultural, historical perspective. We saw Joseph shave before he goes into the presence of Pharaoh. It's possible that Joseph is clean shaven still because Egyptians didn't shave, or they shaved. Semites, the people of God, which were part of the larger group of the Semites, Semitic people, they had beards. And so if you've ever had a friend who had a beard for the longest time, and after 20 years of having a beard, cut their beard, would you recognize them? No. You're like, okay, maybe your eyes look familiar. And so there's a lot of reasons his brothers may not have recognized him, not the least of which they think he's dead. And so Joseph, for lack of a better phrasing it, plays around, he messes with his brothers, he picks on his brothers, and so they leave and they go back. And in chapter 43, the famine in the land is severe. They've used up all their grain, and Jacob says, go back and buy more. And Judah says to his dad, man specifically warned us, you will not see me again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy food for you. And so Israel, Jacob's like, why did you mention you have a brother? Well, I'm not going to send him. He's my second favorite son. I'm not going to send my second favorite son after losing my favorite son. And Judah steps up and makes a promise in verse 8 and verse 9. It says, make me accountable. And you start to see a little bit of a transformation in Judah. The Judah is taking on the form of a leader. Yes, he fell in chapter 38, but he's becoming the leader, it seems like, here in the text. And that's going to play a crucial role in the story. And so they go back and forth, and finally Joseph reveals himself. We're going to kind of skip to the end of Joseph's story, to his brothers, and his brothers are terrified. The brother they sold into slavery because they hated him is now the one who controls their life and death in the palm of their hand. And he says to their brothers, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. One of the key themes in the comments that several of you have made today is God's providence and God's power and God's sovereignty. How God is working through Joseph, even if maybe Joseph doesn't completely realize how or why or to what purpose. You see it here in the text that Joseph is putting pieces together. That I'm here because God put me here. That our God is so powerful that he can turn my prison time, my pain and my suffering into salvation for his people. That God here in the story of Joseph shows us that God was always going to preserve a seed. He would be faithful to his promise. And so the family migrates down to Egypt, part of a larger, probably, migration of Semitic peoples historically during this time frame. In fact, history tells us that there was actually a Semitic pharaoh on the throne of Egypt not long after this all happens historically. And that's going to play a role in what we see in our next Bible study from a daily Bible reading. Because here we are at the end of the life of Joseph, and it is time for us to say, class dismissed.
Auburn. Yeah.
I have to be one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to be seeing double when you.
However, there's been times
We left early, yesterday we had
it's apparently
going eastbound.
Where do you live?
Benny's past Gown and stop at the check and provide
You have to have like Gladiator 2. Have you seen Gladiator 2? Have you seen it? So good. It was actually surprisingly good. I thought it was awesome. Katie loves it.
I put new tires on because
Oh, really?
I got stuck this last break. But you had said, in terms of wonder, individuals spinning out, all-wheel drive. I know when I got the tires put on, they were saying, oh, and so, yeah.
Katie, your dad.
My mom is down with it. Yesterday, not so much.
Yeah, yesterday, we were like that. We walked in, it was 2 o'clock. Well, thank you for saying that.